shortly, we'll be speaking to Dr. Ralf Heckner. He is a Swiss ambassador to Kenya. Like I was saying, he has written an article that has been published on the Standard this morning. Basically, this man is giving a historical perspective on COVID-19 pandemic. He's even taking it personal. He's saying, look, in World War One and then the Spanish flu of 1918, my family was right there in the thick of things. And my great grandfather was, living in Cologne, and this is what they went through, and it's given that very good perspective. But then also he comes and says, I'm looking back, I've been reading at what has happened with various pandemics in the past, and I'm seeing there's so many parallels that we can draw here with that. And now let's hear exactly what those kind of parallels are. Good morning, Dr. Heckner.
Good morning. It's great to be with the Situation Room and Spice FM again. Thank you for having me on your show.
Good morning, Dr. Heckner.
How are you doing?
Very, very well.
Very well.
We are very well, thank you. And thank you very much for being with us again today.
Yeah, it's good to hear your voices and good to hear that you're all doing fine. I hope your loved ones are doing fine as well.
Yes, for sure. And we wish you the same as well.
Thank you. Yeah, we are fine.
Good.
We are fine.
Good.
Thank you.
Now, Doctor, you've written a very interesting perspective here on that's been published in the Standard. Doing what you love to do, which is looking at things from a historical perspective. Now, for those that haven't read this article yet, and they'll be reading it later when they get to buy a copy of the newspaper, just give us a brief of what is it that you're talking about.
Well, as you said, I was a student of history, and I like to try to make sense of what is happening in today's world through a historical perspective. So I put on my glasses as a historian on my nose and try to have a kind of frame of reference of what is going on today. So I was digging into the history of my family from Germany, Cologne, and I was reading books about Cologne in the First World War. And I found incredible parallels of what my great-grandfather in Cologne went through and what we all are going through today in Kenya and all over the world. And I found that what we are living through is a combination of the beginning of World War One, and that was in 1914, combined with the Spanish flu that ravaged the world in 1918. So that is an incredible combination, and I could expand a little bit on that if you want.
Yes.
Good. Go ahead.
In 1914, we had an incredibly connected world. The level of globalization in 1914 was the same as in the mid of the 1980s. So it was an incredibly interconnected world, and that world came to a standstill with the beginning of World War I. All existing functional commercial and people-to-people ties were demolished. And for Cologne, for example, that meant you couldn't import meat and pigs from the Netherlands, a country that was only 80 kilometers from Cologne away. The whole tourism collapsed. Cologne had always been a tourism place because of the fact that Cologne has one of the most important Catholic cathedrals in Europe. The whole economy collapsed, the domestic economy, because all men went to war. So that's what happened within hours and days as it happened to us during that coronavirus crisis. And further on, what you saw was that the administrations had to readjust, businesses had to readjust. You needed to come up with an administration that was now catering for the basic needs of the people in a city. because food was lacking, and security was an issue too, because we had so many soldiers in the city. And businesses had to readjust too. They were then suddenly producing ammunition, and what you see today is very much the same. You have Kenyan businesses that are now producing masks instead of cloths.
Yep. So basically, it's basically showing that there's this. It brings in some positive side to it as well. For a country, you start looking inwardly, and you start seeing that there are many opportunities for you to hop onto.
Yes, I mean, once we are through this crisis, I think we can be positive.
Yep.
There is also a lesson that I learned by studying the history of my family, which went through 2 world wars and at least 3 financial depreciations in the 20th century. And if I have a look at the time after World War One and after the Spanish flu, you had an incredible economic boom time, the so-called golden 20s.
Yes.
It was not only economically, but also when you having a look at music and culture and fashion, it was an incredible time to live. So there is, as you say in English, after rain there is often a rainbow, and after the World War and the Spanish flu, you had a good and amazing economic uptake. And today I think we are already seeing not yet an economic update. This has to wait for quite some time. But what I see is it is amazing that the whole global scientific community is now searching for one thing together, and that is a vaccine against the coronavirus.
Yeah.
And I cannot think of any other moment in the world's history where the whole scientific community was researching the same thing. And I also see more solidarity. You know, at the beginning we all were looking after our selves. Now you have French hospitals that are helping out Swiss hospitals and vice versa. And I even received yesterday a communication from the Foreign Ministry about masks being produced in Kenya. Is there a need in Europe? So there is now a wave, I would say, of solidarity also here in Kenya with that fund that was opened by the Kenyan business community.
Right. Dr. Heckner, if we look at, just again, going towards those historical perspectives, if that looking at between 1914 and 1918, a lot of the processes are documented, but a lot of the feeling and the mindset of people, unfortunately, is not. If we look at what we are facing now and what people are feeling, maybe their rights being abused by things that they're being asked of, can we draw parallels between the same in terms of what ruling? Because if you look at the Spanish flu, just like you talked about, around that time, people were asked to stay at home, businesses were shut down, kinds of things also put in place to make sure that it was mitigated. Can we then draw any kind of parallels between then the effect that it had then and what it would have now in terms of curbing COVID and when it comes to things like people's rights and civil liberties?
I mean, what happened between 1914 and 18, and especially at the beginning of the war, and also with the flu, was a clear setback when it comes to the democratic functioning of state. I cannot think of a moment after World War II when the Federal Council, the Swiss government, was ruling based on emergency law. So Switzerland is now ruled by emergency law by the government. And the Federal Council has the clear objective that this period of emergency law and governing and administrating based on it is as short as possible. So what is true for Switzerland is true for so many countries. Freedom of movement is being curtailed. You cannot move as you want in a lot of countries.
Right.
I have a family in Italy. They have been in a lockdown now for 6 weeks.
Yeah.
So important here is, yes, a lot of things have changed radically, and we are finding ourselves in a totally new world. But when it comes to the rule of law and the democratic procedures and the freedoms that we have, they have to be first and foremost respected as much as possible already now. And where they have been curtailed based on emergency law, they have that period has to be as short as possible. So that is a very valid point you raised. One of the most important questions, I think, beyond fighting the coronavirus is to maintain our democratic institutions, and especially by abiding to the human rights and by managing the crisis intelligently and successfully to strengthen our democratic institutions.
Dr. Heckner, history does a very good job of documenting what has happened and even in analyzing it, but in so doing, does it actually tell us how well we learn from these past issues?
That is a very good question. First and foremost, history is not repeating itself exactly, so in that respect, learning is good, but it doesn't mean that you can apply it one-to-one. As I said, I think we learned from history, because if I compare how the world is reacting now to that pandemic and how little the pandemic and the Spanish flu were understood in 1918, I think a lot has been done when it comes to fighting pandemics. Learning means, I think, that we learn from catastrophes. And after World War I, there was that idea from the U.S. President Woodrow Wilson to establish the League of Nations, so that nations would come together peacefully. That was a failure, and we had World War II. And after World War II, you had the creation of the United Nations, and that was a successful establishment. You had the World Bank, you had the IMF, all institutions that are now working to fight the economic, political crisis and also the pandemic. So what I think is, after this huge crisis, and what we are going through, as I said, is the beginning of World War I and the Spanish flu combined, we have to come up with new institutions to cope with crises like this, and also to have a consensus on what kind of institutions we need. And I think what we need are institutions and a consensus that are looking after the poor. We need inclusivity. With this crisis, we see whether you are poor or rich, you can be hit by the virus equally. It is an equalizer. So that is my first point. Look after the poor and go for inclusivity. And my second point is, we have to look after our planet urgently. If this is a crisis, the pandemic, an environmental meltdown will be thousands times bigger.
Yeah.
So there is a huge urgency to look after the planet. And for that we need a consensus, how to do that, and we also might to come up with new institutions. And if we do that, I think then the biggest lesson that we can learn now is to look after the poor and to look after our planet, and with that give a new perspective and a positive future to our children and to this planet.
Right. There are those that have said there are some institutions that we have presently that will either be rejigged or have to be rejigged or just done away with altogether. We've seen an onslaught now starting in the World Health Organization and the World Health Organization's management of this particular pandemic. Do you see some of these institutions surviving, or do you see them getting a new face?
After this crisis, we all have to have a very clear and thorough look at what happened globally and in each and every country, and how each and every country and institution, national and global institution, reacted. And we have to be courageous in doing this and fair and transparent.
Yeah.
And based on that, we will see who acted responsibly and who acted irresponsibly.
Yeah.
And based on that, we can then reform institutions, reform processes and structures, or maybe just to come up with a new one. And we will also see which countries have been transparent, forward-coming, in solidarity, and which ones are not. And that those countries might be the countries that come up with the best ideas, and the world population will follow those ideas because they are based on a track record of a country or of businessmen and women.
Dr. Heckner, you've given a very interesting analogy of, and it's a reality, that for the first time, let's say the world scientific bodies are actually working in tandem. I want you to consider this perspective, that it is more in search of self-preservation rather than in the preservation of the planet, because COVID-19 is affecting each and everyone on this earth. It isn't the first viral attack we've had. We had HIV, we had Ebola. We didn't see this coming together, not on this scale. So I am asking you to consider this perspective. This getting together, this huge confluence of scientific minds, is because each and every of those scientific minds represents a part of the world that is directly threatened by COVID-19.
Yes, you're absolutely right. This is out of self-preservation, but nevertheless, they are all working together. And the other point is, what are the peoples of this world asking for? They're now asking from the scientific community and businesses and governments and universities to come up with a vaccine. And afterwards, they will ask for a good environment, jobs, healthcare. And so there's an incredible voice out there. And you have to hear that voice also for self-preservation, because otherwise nations and people will fail. But there's a whole self-preservation out there, meaning we all want to see this planet survive and to see mankind survive on that planet too. So self-preservation, yes, but at the end of the day, I think it is survival in a positive way of all of us that is at stake and that we are aiming for together.
I want to go back to something I raised earlier about lessons learned, and I am thinking this. Before COVID-19, we had other coronaviruses that had visited the planet and had also caused a decent amount of harm. What seems to have come to the fore is generally called a lack of preparedness. But I don't think this is entirely true. I think it's more a lack of preparedness for an onslaught of communicable diseases. What is your take?
Did I understand your question correctly, that you see a lack of preparedness when it comes to pandemics?
Yes, there's a lack of preparedness, because if you're talking about non-communicable diseases, you're talking about heart diseases, you're talking about diabetes, many places in the West are very well equipped and very well prepared to deal with these diseases. But when you're talking about pandemics, if you're talking about communicable diseases, then the preparedness was inadequate worldwide.
Yeah, I agree with you. And this will be one lesson that we all learn. The lack of preparedness for such a kind of pandemic. I can tell you, in the drawers of the Swiss administrations, there were huge books with the title on it, Pandemics. I had them in my hand when I was head of crisis management. The World Health Organization has a pandemic document and procedures. I think they're all dating back to 2005. So what I see here is not only a lack of preparedness, meaning that what was written in the document was also there in reality. So if you say we have so many ICU units, you should have so many ICU units and they should be functioning. You should have the staff for it. So that is the lack of preparedness. Not what was on paper, but what we see in reality. There was a lack of preparedness to be, I think, transparent and quick all over the world when it comes to deal with this crisis. And last but not least, universal health care is maybe the most important thing to deal with such a pandemic, meaning that every human being on this planet has a certain health care level which can take care of something like a pandemic. So what President Kenyatta put on his Big Four agenda, universal health care, was spot on.
Yeah.
And 4 years ago, we had a conference of ambassadors from the African continent in Switzerland. And we came up with one thing, what was needed when it comes to our engagement in Africa, and that was healthcare. We were spot on there too. So now what we have to do is we have to deliver on universal healthcare all over the planet.
If we look at the planet now, it really doesn't matter who we see. There are quite a number from what we call the developed world, underdeveloped, developing world. Everybody's health system seems to be suffering from the cracks. Do you think that after this, we will see where there will be a deliberate effort made then to make sure that the health system at least is top notch and delivering to its people what is required?
Yes, but we don't need a top notch healthcare system. We need a good healthcare system that can cater to the basic needs of all people on this planet. That's what we need. We don't need the best heart surgeons in every single country and in every single hospital on this planet. But we need a decent, capable healthcare system that can cater for the basic needs of the people. And the pandemic, this is a basic need.
It sorts out the problem. Dr. Ralf Heckner, we want to thank you very much for speaking to us this morning.
Well, I thank you. You told me 10 minutes. I think we're a little bit long.
Just a little bit.
The discussion had quite a life of its own.
Yes,
Don't blame us, blame you. Thank you, and keep sharing your gems of wisdom on this.
I wish you well, and I wish all the listeners well in this difficult times.
Thank you
for
so
having
much.
me with you.
Thank you very much.
Asante sana. Have a good day as well.
Same to you. Bye.
Dr. Ralf Heckner is a Swiss ambassador to Kenya. He is a historian, and he started by telling us he likes to put on his glasses on his nose, the historian glasses on his nose, and look back at events that have shaped the world from a historical perspective. Very good perspective there.
Chilled Spice.